Hello, this is Lee Hayes Byron again with Sarasota County Extension and Sustainability. We want to thank you all for joining us today. We have a webinar planned on property assessed clean energy, which we're going to call PACE. And this is one of our first webinars in this form. So if you have any trouble, let us know. Probably the best way to do that is with the chat box, which you can find if you move your cursor down to the bottom middle of your screen. You can see chat, and then you can type questions in there for any of the panelists, and we'll get back to you. So let me start off by explaining what we're going to cover today. We have an hour scheduled. The topic is property assessed clean energy financing, as we discussed, and I'm going to go over what it is, how PACE in Sarasota County has come to be and how it's unique, and then we'll go into how it works. So what qualifies, what types of projects qualify, how it actually works for a property owner, for the contractors, that kind of thing. And we will then spend a good amount of time on the benefits and risks so that we are talking both pros and cons and everyone's aware of both sides of the issue. We'll talk a bit about how Sarasota County's PACE policy is unique, and we'll also talk about other financing tools in addition to PACE. Along the way, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box. Again, if you didn't hear the instructions earlier, you just go down to the middle of your screen, click on chat, and it'll send your questions to me at the front. Toward the end, we'll try to open it up for discussion beyond that, but I'm happy to take questions through the chat box along the way. So I think we'll get started. I'm not seeing any questions yet. Hopefully that everybody is hearing me and following along. So the first thing is, what is PACE? Why are we here today? Property Assessed Clean Energy is a financing tool that lets commercial and residential property owners finance energy or hurricane improvements through an assessment on their property taxes. You may be familiar with non-ad valorem assessments like lighting districts. Some of our neighborhoods have a lighting district established that allows all the residents to pay for the street lighting for that neighborhood, for instance, and they do that through a non-ad valorem assessment on their property taxes. What's different about this one, though, is that it is voluntary for property owners, and it's one property by one property at a time. So someone in North Sarasota in one single family house could decide to participate, and someone down in Venice could decide to participate. So the district isn't a geographic area, it is the people who decide to opt into the program. PACE was enabled by the state legislature in 2010, and our program here in Sarasota County began as approval in 2018 and has just launched in early 2019. And I'll explain some of those steps as we go along. So there's a sort of complicated structure given that district model. PACE local governments are the districts. These are special districts that were established just for the purpose of issuing bonds and financing projects through PACE. They then hire a third-party administrator that actually is a private sector company that implements the program on their behalf. And I'll talk about their roles a bit more, but basically they're the ones that qualify the property owners, engage the contractors, that kind of thing. We have 4 programs that are have interlocal agreements with Sarasota County to enable their districts to cover our area, and they're listed there. But only 2 of them have actually completed the process to be eligible to operate in our community, and I'll cover that in a minute. Nationally, we just want to give a little context. In the United States, 20 states have PACE enabled, but those are mostly for commercial only. Only 3 states have residential, and those states are Florida, California, and Missouri. So here in Sarasota County, our discussions on PACE began when the state passed the legislation back in 2010. We've been talking about it for a long time, and our community wanted to be a bit cautious given some of the risks that I'll talk about later. And so we watched it for a while. The board has talked about it several times, but they wanted to watch as it developed across the state and across the nation. As it became more implemented and we were able to see best practices, we were able to turn those best practices into an ordinance in October of 2017. After that, interlocal agreements were developed with the 4 PACE providers that I showed you in 2018, and those providers then needed to do agreements with the property appraiser and the tax collector which happened at the end of December of last year. In parallel with that process, I went to each of our cities in Sarasota County and presented to their commissions about what PEACE is and whether they would want to opt into our program. And all 4 of them decided to do so, with the last approving it in January of 2019. The last step for our PEACE providers is to prove compliance with our local ordinance and agreements. In order to do that, they have to provide us with documents that prove they've incorporated our requirements into their program agreements and their contractor agreements and that kind of thing. So that is what 2 of the providers have done, and the other 2 are currently working on that. The 2 that are approved are Renew Financial and Y Green, and the other 2 that are listed are in progress and working on their documents currently. So where can you take advantage of PACE within Sarasota County? Thankfully, all of our cities joined the program, and Y Green is available in the unincorporated area of Sarasota County as well as all of the cities. The only difference is Renew Financial is not available in the town of Longboat Key yet, but it is available in all the other jurisdictions. That's just a technical issue that they're working on because Longboat Key actually falls in 2 counties, so they're figuring out how to enter that into their system and make sure they're in the right jurisdiction. But so again, all jurisdictions can take advantage of Y Green, and all jurisdictions except Longboat currently can take advantage of Renew Financial. So what qualifies for PACE? The qualifying improvements by state statute can only be in the categories of energy efficiency, renewable energy, and wind resistance. So the examples here list what that tends to look like. On the efficiency side, it is often related to air conditioning or insulation. You can also do lighting retrofits. You can even do electric vehicle charging stations. One thing it's important to understand, though, is that they need to have an energy benefit. So for instance, if you add a pool heater where you didn't have a pool heater before, that does not count as energy efficiency, so it could not be applied to PACE financing. Hopefully that makes sense. But if you did have a pool heater, say you had an electric pool heater and you were shifting to solar pool heating, that is an energy benefit and PACE could be used there. On the renewable side, for us in Florida, mostly we see projects that are related to solar water heating or solar photovoltaic. Photovoltaic is the type of solar that actually produces electricity to offset your electric bill. Wind resistance is probably the most popular of the improvements here in Florida related to PACE, and that's everything from a whole new roof to just roof improvements where you're doing roof tie downs for hurricane hardening. You can also buy shutters. You can buy new windows or doors. You can buy generators, but they need to be permanently affixed to the building. It can't be a portable generator. So that's that last bullet, is that all the improvements need to be permanent to the building and can't be sort of portable to a different property, because the financing is actually tied to the property, not to the owner. I explained that the most popular improvements here in Florida are related to hurricane protection. You can see that that is a large majority of the projects so far. The next most popular is air conditioning, and then the others are sort of scattered between there. So why does Sarasota County care about PACE? It is mostly that public benefit that the state statute requires. So we think that it's important that people save energy and are prepared for hurricanes. On the energy side, we've found that the average Sarasota County household pays $1,200 per year on electricity costs. And you may say, oh, I pay a lot more than that. And so that's just an average. Some of the homes pay much more than that and have a lot of opportunity for reducing that waste. We also find that our low-income families are paying more per square foot than our higher-income families, and we'd like to address that energy equity. In terms of solar, there's a lot of momentum on solar right now, but we still only have a handful of solar interconnections, which is solar photovoltaic connected to the grid. About 759 installations in Sarasota County. That may seem like a lot, but for a population of nearly 400,000, we think there's a lot of opportunity to grow there. On the hurricane side, those of you who were around for Hurricane Irma probably remember how disruptive that was for our community. but it really wasn't as bad as it could have been. Our maximum sustained winds were only 48 miles per hour. But even with that, 83% of our customers, our residents lost power, and some for a very long time. We also had over 20,000 people in shelters, and over 400 homes were impacted by the storm. So after that, we actually got a lot of calls from people saying, I want my home to be prepared for the next hurricane season, and I'm interested in creative financing to make that possible. So PACE is one of many options that are available for financing these types of improvements, and we'll talk about the pros and cons in a minute. So how is PACE going to work? What are sort of the mechanisms for this? From the property owner's perspective, you would treat it like you would any other home improvement. You'd start by getting quotes from contractors, and we strongly encourage you to get multiple quotes, at least 3 quotes for every project. And in that process, you want to ask those contractors, what kind of financing do you offer? And if they offer PACE, that would be one of the options they would present to you, but hopefully it wouldn't be the only one. You would want them to also give you thoughts on private sector financing in other ways, and then you would also want to talk to your bank and your financial advisor and do some research outside of your contractors to figure out what other financing might be available. So you would get multiple quotes for the project, you would get multiple quotes for the financing, and then you decide what is best for you and your family. Now, if you want to do PACE, you need to make sure that your contractor is affiliated with one or several of the PACE providers. But if you have a contractor that you want to use and they are not, they can sign up with one of the PACE providers, but it does take a little bit of time because they have to get trained and approved. So if you do choose PACE, you've determined that's the best option for you. You would then sign a financing agreement with the district. But it's the contractor that's probably the one that's going to be sitting in your dining room at the table with you talking about both the project and the financing. So you need to be sure to understand that they are not the company providing the financing, they're just the conduit for that. And if you have any questions, you need to contact the PACE providers directly. The contractor's only paid after the property owner signs off and says that, yes, I'm satisfied with this project. Then, once the project's done, the property owner would repay that financing only once per year through their non-ad valorem assessment on their property taxes. If they can get their bank to escrow it, they can pay it through escrow if they have other escrowed taxes and insurance. But it is possible that the bank won't do that in time for your first year, or might make it somewhat complicated. So you need to be prepared to pay it in that first tax year if you are escrowing everything else. So this is a quick look at what some of the relationships look like, and it's important to understand that dotted line. Sarasota County's only role is to enable PACE financing in our community. We are not involved in the financing agreements. We're not involved in the relationship with the contractors. That is all directly related to the PACE district, the third-party administrators, and the contractors themselves. This is an idea of what the tax bill might look like. So this is a example tax bill from Sarasota County, and you can see in the red circle that those are the non-ad valorem assessments that a property might have. They may have an assessment for being a part of a fire rescue district. They may pay for their solid waste services through that line item. And if they had signed up to do an assessment through PACE, that's where that would show up. And they would have a line item with the annual amount, just like the $140 for the fire rescue. But the important part is the total. This here, without the PACE, is $26.19. So that's what has to be paid, and it can't be paid partially. If you want to pay the $26.19, but not the extra $1,000 that gets added, say, for a PACE financing, it's still seen as being delinquent on your taxes. So we asked the PACE providers for some example financing scenarios. Now, these are really detailed with lots of numbers, and I should have said at the beginning that we are happy to send the presentation out to you if we have your emails through registration. So we can send you this so you don't have to jot down all the details, but we'll just talk it through a little bit. So the first type of project we asked about was a solar photovoltaic installation at $25,000. The annual assessment for Y-Green at an interest rate of 7.99% is just over $3,000. They proposed a term of 20 years. It's important to understand that PACE financing can be a term, a length of the assessment that is equal to, up to or equal to the amount of life that that product may have. So many solar systems are warranted to 25 years, so it could be a 25-year PACE assessment. In this case, they set it for 20, and the annual assessment of $3,000. There's some program fees, there's an origination fee, and all of that adds up to a total amount financed of just over $29,000. That is everything all in one package, and for them, there is no upfront cost to this program. You would then pay the first year's annual assessment when your taxes come due. But what's, I think, the most important two pieces of this for being an informed consumer is that total payments line. So if you multiply the $3,000 annual assessment times the 20 years, you are actually paying $60,000 over the life of that project for the $25,000 solar installation. Now that may seem like a lot, but if you've ever had a mortgage, you understand that the total cost of your home over the life of your mortgage is far more than the list price of the home that you agreed to. So it is just like any financing in that the cost of capital is fairly high once it's amortized over the full life of the term. But we want you to be well informed on this and to be asking these types of questions so you can compare apples to apples. Now, the other piece that's really important is what if you want to pay it off early? You decide you're going to pay it annually for 7 years and then you have enough money to pay it off and you don't want to be paying that interest anymore. We in the county commission has felt very strongly that there should not be a prepayment penalty for residential in PACE. And so that is in our ordinance, but what you need to know is that there is a minimum, and that minimum is $2,500. So you can't get, say, an inheritance of $1,000 and decide, oh, I'm just going to pay it down $1,000 now. You have to wait until you have $2,500 to pay it off. We asked a similar scenario for Renew Financial, a $25,000 solar system. They chose a 25-year term, and they have an interest rate of 6.99%. So this is a lower interest rate, but a higher number of years. And you can see that even though it has a lower interest rate, the total cost is almost the same. It's at $59,391 compared to the $60,000 for the shorter term but higher interest rate. So it's interesting to see what the difference in the years and the interest rate do to the actual total cost of this capital. So they have a similar early payoff point of $2,500. So they have the same issue, and there is a fee for paying off as well. The previous one, you can see that fee was $85. I don't have the details of the Renew PACE here. Alliance NRG is another of the PACE providers that's not actually active in Sarasota County yet, but they also gave us an example. They did a 20-year term at a 7.49% interest rate, and their total cost came out at $53,000. Okay, so that's a solar system, but what if you wanted to do new hurricane-proof windows? That we estimated at like a $10,000 project. So the annual PACE assessment for Y-Green was $1,757. They put a 10-year term on that and an interest rate of 7.49%. Again, there are program fees and origination fees, and all that adds up to a $12,000 total financed amount at the beginning of the project. That total project cost at the end of the term is $17,575. Again, Renew Financial has a 15-year term and a 7.14 interest rate. So comparing the two, we've got a longer term and a shorter interest rate, and their total cost at the end is $24,000. Similarly, Alliance has a 20-year term, a 7.49% interest rate, and $21,000 at the end of the project. Okay, so hopefully those examples give you a sense of what the annual costs might be for these kinds of projects, as well as what the long-term costs of the financing might look like. So what might PACE look like for condos? We've talked about what single-family homes might look like, but for condos, it's a little bit different. Condos have an individual set of responsibilities inside the condo, and then they have these external responsibilities that are part of the association. So the internal has the same process as single family, but the external oftentimes includes windows. It usually includes the roof and some other areas. So if the condo association wants to take advantage of PACE, that's where it gets complicated. To my knowledge, they have not yet identified a solution to that, to do it at the association level, but they are interested in working with condo associations. So if you're a condo owner and your association is interested in this, the PACE providers have just said, get in touch with them and they'll talk about what's possible and what might not be. If you're a contractor or you know one that wants to be a part of it, they can get trained and approved by the PACE providers. I would encourage contractors to get approved by multiple PACE providers, because as you can see, they offer different interest rates, they have different terms, and they even have different responsibilities for the contractors. So to give your customers the best comparative options, you should be connected to multiple PACE providers. So then you would, in those conversations about the project and the financing options, you'd present PACE as one of the options for your customer. But as we've talked about earlier, you only get paid after the customer signs off on the project, and certainly after the inspection is complete. But even after that, the customer has to sign off a completion certificate. The contractors need to follow what's called a code of conduct, and they in particular need to be really careful about how they market the program. Our ordinance says that contractors can't market the program as a government-sponsored or government-subsidized program. They can't reference Sarasota County or any of our cities. They need to be really careful about misrepresenting this program. And they also have a code of conduct in terms of customer service and making sure they're representing the terms correctly and all of those kinds of things. So what are the benefits to the community? We've already talked about our community values, our residents and businesses being prepared for hurricanes. We also think there's environmental benefits to to reducing wasted energy, and there's certainly some financial benefit to that. By not wasting the energy and paying the utility, you can use that money for something else. That's part of this calculation in that possible economic development piece that you see on the slide. The savings from the utility and potentially from insurance bills for the hurricane side, added with additional projects for building contractors that may or may not have happened otherwise, there's to some extent a multiplier effect for PACE projects in terms of economic development in the community. There are also studies that show a possible increase in the property value when you do these kinds of projects, but it's important to know that that is really dependent on the real estate market. So even if you have added a $25,000 solar system to your home, and in a good market, that would be returned to you, in a bad market, there's no guarantee that you'll get that back. So you've got to be sure that you can pay it off if you need to. So the national market for PACE has really grown in the last 7 or 8 years, but you can see that the vast majority of the projects and the dollars are on the residential side, which is the left, compared to the commercial side on the right. Even though more states have enabled commercial PACE, it really is primarily a residential market. There are good opportunities for commercial though, so we want to be sure that folks know that you can do both here in Sarasota County. Now, for the property owner, these are some of the benefits that we have heard from both residents and from the PACE providers. And again, these are very specific to individuals, so you'll need to be sure that it is correct for your family and it doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. So the first part is contractor management. I mentioned the code of conduct and the training. So if you were to pick 3 contractors and get quotes from them yourself, you wouldn't necessarily have those qualification checks, the license checks. You would have to do all of that. The PACE providers provide that sort of intermediary role of checking on their contractors and keeping an eye on them. And they also do dispute resolution after the fact. You cannot rely on that completely, but it's an extra layer of support that you might find helpful. The energy savings themselves are a benefit, as could be the insurance savings. So the eligible measures list is a list of products that the PACE providers require of their contractors. So they shouldn't be allowing just code minimum for an air conditioner. You have to use an air conditioner that is more efficient than would be required otherwise. And the contractor needs to give you an estimate of the energy savings that that project would provide. That's something that our ordinance requires. There's also supposed to be a fairly quick approval process, so some property owners find that valuable. Other benefits we've heard are that it shouldn't affect your credit because it's attached to the property and not to you. The longer repayment term is something that people find valuable, but it does add to that long-term cost of the capital. So you need to remember that if you use the term up to 30 years for, say, a solar or a roof, you're dramatically increasing the cost of capital for the project. There, as I said earlier, there's no prepayment penalties. On the commercial side, there can be prepayment penalties. So if you're on the commercial side, you'll need to pay attention to that in the contracts. And there's no upfront costs, as I explained. So they incorporate all of the fees and interest, capitalized interest, into the financed amount, and you just pay that first property tax assessment in the first year. The fixed interest rates is something else. People asked about that in another workshop we had. The interest rates do vary over time, but once you're in, it's locked in for the term of the financing. That last bullet says the interest may be deductible. We are not tax advisors. We need you to be sure to check with yours on that one. There is an article on the PACE Nation website that talks about how the interest of a PACE assessment may be deductible, but it really depends. So you need to definitely check with your accountant. So what are some of the risks, the limitations of this type of financing? Some people have assumed that that there might be lower interest rates than there actually are. The interest rates, I've been told, are between 6 and 9%, but there are also the fees that we've talked about. It is possible for the contractors to buy down the interest rate, but they are then going to pass that on to the property owner. So that is a questionable benefit. You would need to do the math on that. So as I've said many times, you'll want to compare all the financing options to be sure you're using the one that is best for you. Qualifying for PACE does not actually guarantee that you're able to pay. Now, when you get a mortgage, the approval process is fairly intense. The approval process is less rigorous for PACE than it is for that type of financing. So you need to be sure that you are applying individual responsibility and thinking about all scenarios. Will you be able to pay for this financing over the life of the term? Think about what happens if you lose your job or if you have a medical crisis. These are something that are very serious decisions, and everybody needs to think through their own personal situation. One thing that is the subject of most misunderstandings about PACE is that it really can affect the sale or refinance of your property. When PACE was first established, it was thought that it would carry from property owner to property owner. That has not been the case. We have heard that probably 70% and possibly more of sales and refinancings require that the PACE assessment be paid off at point of sale. So that's really important to understand. You're going to have to find a buyer who is willing to accept the assessment and a mortgage company that is willing to accept the assessment. That mortgage company is really where the biggest hitch tends to be. The mortgage companies don't like being second in order should something happen, and they would have to accept that. And that's where that 70% is usually coming into play. It is required by law that the seller must inform future buyers of this lien, and therefore there has to be an addendum on any contracts, and there has to be a disclosure to anyone who is looking at buying the home or the property. And most important is this last bullet of failure to pay could result in loss of the property. I mentioned earlier that you have to pay your whole property tax bill, not just part of it, or else you end up not being in compliance with the property taxes. And this is the order of consequences for not paying your property taxes. The first is that there are penalties and fees, and then the property tax delinquency is advertised and a tax certificate is sold. And that then allows someone else, an investor, to pay your property taxes directly, and then you owe it to them along with significant interest and fees. In order for you to get rid of that lien, you have to pay off all of the delinquent property taxes, all of the fees and interest that have accrued, and you have to do it within 2 years. At the end of 2 years, if it still hasn't been paid off, the property can be sold in a public sale. So this is true for anybody who doesn't pay their property taxes, but as you can see, the PACE assessment can add a fairly significant amount to those property taxes, so you need to understand that risk. So what's unique here in Sarasota County? We watched this around the country for many years and looked at best practices across the country as well as across the state. Department of Energy had a document with best practices. PACE Nation, which is the industry group, had a document with best practices. And we looked at our colleagues' ordinances and rules over in Broward, Palm Beach, and Miami-Dade counties. They each had different requirements, and we took essentially all of them and put them all into our rules. And we think we have the strongest PACE program across the state of Florida here in Sarasota County. And that's from the eye of consumer protections. Here's some of them that we've added. We added many more disclosures so that the property owners understand the risks and terms. That NTPO is called a notice to property owner. We required an additional document in addition to the PACE agreement, the financing agreement, that summarizes the most important pieces of the agreement. So it takes what's maybe a 12 or a 20-page document, it puts the most important things right up front in a one-page document that the property owner is required to sign in addition to the full agreement. So we're adding a step so that they're forced to look at the most important pieces. You, of course, should read the whole document, but this was a way to pull the most important parts to the front. We also added customer service and complaint procedures so that those contractors would be held accountable and the PACE providers would be required to follow through on any complaints. We added contractor management, marketing, and even price standards so that the PACE provider must hold their contractors to make sure they're not charging out of market prices for these types of improvements. That's not to say that they require them to be particularly low cost, just that they can't be price gouging. We also added additional qualifying criteria for residential. So let's look at who qualifies for PACE. As I said earlier, both residential and commercial property owners are eligible. Those property owners cannot have delinquent property taxes or involuntary liens. They can't have defaults. They cannot be in bankruptcy, but if they do have a bankruptcy in their past, that is allowed, but it's of course up to the PACE provider. Then we added 4 additional requirements in Sarasota County that residential property owners need to meet, but they only have to meet 1 of the 4. The PACE providers have chosen to do this last one, where they have to have 10% equity in the property, and then once you add the PACE assessment on top of the mortgage, you cannot exceed the just value of your home. So you still need to have some equity left over. The others are still possible, but the PACE providers have chosen to do that last one and incorporate that into their documents. Okay, so as I showed earlier in that flow chart, the roles for the cities and county are fairly limited. We are, like today, educating our residents on PACE and other financing tools. We want to make sure people understand the pros and cons. We are not endorsing PACE. We're just recognizing that it is allowed in our community and we want people to understand it. We also are going to verify that the local governments are following the ordinance. And the way we do that is by looking at metrics that we receive from the PACE providers quarterly. And we also follow up on any complaints that they have to report to us, and we make sure that those are being followed through on. And if at any point we feel that they are not meeting the ordinance, we can actually terminate their agreement with the county. The same is true for the cities. They review the metrics that we provide to them, and they too can opt out if they're finding the program does not provide benefit to their residents. So I've shared a lot of concerns about the tool in addition to some of the possible benefits. So what else is out there if financing through PACE is not the right tool for you? Cash or paying up front is always going to be the cheapest option because there isn't that cost of capital that we discussed earlier. So if you have the money to pay for these improvements up front, that's going to be the lowest cost option. But even some people who do have the money to pay for it up front are in some cases choosing not to use their cash for that purpose. So they then need to understand what the other financing options are available, just like everyone else. So home equities tend to have lower interest rates than PACE in many cases, but they do have requirements like equity and shorter terms, and certainly more rigorous credit checks and that kind of thing. So the qualifying pieces on that can be a bit more. And we've also heard from some people, yeah, I have equity, but I want to use my equity to renovate my kitchen or something aesthetic purposes. So again, these are all very personal decisions, but you need to be aware of the risks and benefits and make those decisions having done a good amount of homework. This home style energy mortgage loans is a tool that I will tell you I have not heard anyone actually use, and a couple mortgage providers locally didn't know what it was. So if you wanted to use this, you'd need to do a little more homework and find a provider that would be willing to provide it for you. But it is a program that exists at the federal level that is in order to encourage energy improvements on top of a newer mortgage or a refinance, where they provide additional 15% beyond the value of the property, specifically for energy improvements. There are also these bank-provided financing that are called express loans or online loans, and this is just one example of one that I talked to that actually at one point was specific to solar. This used to be First Green Bank in Orlando. They're now Seacoast, but they still have this product. So that interest rate, they told me, was between 7 and 10%, depending on the term and credit. And it is due on sale, so there's 100% guarantee that it will have to pay it off at sale. But you don't need equity. It is an unsecured loan, and they can go up to $50,000. There's also a program called the Solar Energy Loan Fund. It was started in St. Lucie County and now has offices also in Pinellas and Hillsborough counties. And they have some unique financing tools that are catered to veterans, to single mothers. They have some crowdsourcing options. And they try to find creative financing, often for lower income residents, but not exclusively. So that may be worth looking into. And then there are often unsecured consumer loans and credit cards and all kinds of other things that are available. But the further down this list we get, the higher those interest rates tend to be. The last bullet is a low-income option that for our lowest income residents, if they qualify, the Sarasota Office of Housing and Community Development does offer a loan program, which has no interest and no payments until the home changes owners. But as I said, it has a very low income qualification, and it also can have a long wait time in order to have it implemented. So if there are low income residents interested, they should start there and see if that is something that works for them, because that's clearly going to be the lowest cost option. But just remember that there are some hurdles to pass on that one as well. So this is one of my last slides. I just wanted to share what I've been sharing, which is that PACE is only one of many options for paying for these types of projects. And we need people to do their due diligence, to really research in depth all of the options for financing and talk to their financial advisors, get some help to compare, because it will be hard to compare apples to apples. So you want to think about what that long-term cost of the capital might be and how you find the best option for you. An important point that I think I may have said is if you're financing anything, no matter what the tool is, try to get the shortest term that you can afford, because the longer it goes, the higher those costs end up being. We have a website on our Sarasota County page, which if you go to scgov.net/sustainability, there'll be that side navigation where you see the word PACE in green, and you click on that. And this page will come up. It has a general what is PACE. It provides links to each of the approved providers. This is where we will update the information when the additional providers are approved. And if you scroll down a bit, it also has the information on these workshops. And this is where the recordings of this workshop will be, and some additional frequently asked questions that we're working on to put up there soon. So this is going to be a really good resource for you if you have other questions. So I think, let me ask if there are any PACE providers on the call that would like to share any additional information. If you can just sort of type in the chat box if you want to share. I don't think I see anyone registered. Oh, Emily, you're on. Emily, if you're on and would like to say something, I have made you a presenter.
Okay, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Great. I don't have anything to add other than I really appreciate the great presentation.
Okay, is that all, Emily? I think we've lost you. I'm going to leave you a presenter if you have anything to add during the question and answer. So let me ask anyone else that if you have questions that you would like to ask, just go ahead and type them in the chat box and we will answer them from there. And we would also welcome your comments in the chat box if you want to share anything. And the chat box is down at the bottom in the center. Just move your cursor down to the bottom and that should show up. It'll say chat. There is a question of someone that says, how long would it take for a contractor to get approved for PACE? Emily, maybe that's something that you would like to answer from your perspective and maybe introduce which organization you're with.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So our contractor training is pretty thorough and rigorous. It requires a training with a PowerPoint presentation, a live interaction with one of our regional account managers, which is sort of the liaison between the contractor, property owner in our program. They're full-time employees of Y-Green. And so we have them sit with the new contractors, go through the presentation, and make sure they understand how the process works, submitting applications, interfacing with the customer. Usually that takes about a day. So it depends on scheduling for that in-person presentation. But our account managers are very eager to get new contractors on board that are, you know, vetted and certified with all of the requirements of our program. So they're eager to make those appointments as soon as possible. So I'd say about a day, depending on the availability of the contractor.
Thanks, Emily.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions? I've got one here. So when I sell my home, what happens to the assessment on my taxes? That's a really good question, an important piece. So it depends on what is negotiated with the buyer. So if the buyer does not want to accept the assessment, or the mortgage company for the buyer doesn't want to accept the assessment, then it needs to be paid off. But it's to some extent a negotiated piece, but it's informed by what the mortgage company is willing to take. So in most cases, like I said, it will have to be paid off at the point of sale, and it's included as a negotiated item, and it would be required to be proven in the closing documents. So you would need to pay it off and get a proof that it had been paid off, and that would be one of the terms of the closing documents. Bonnie, if that didn't answer your question, feel free to follow up. I have another question of when is the loan recorded on my taxes? Also a good question. So by state statute, it must be recorded within 5 days of the agreement being finalized. And Emily, if you have different answers on any of these, please speak up.
Will do.
And then I have, can you review the financing examples again? So we're going to send the financing examples out again. And yes, if you did the math, you'll see that one of them doesn't add up to the total financing amount and the specific detailed fees. And they are getting me those line items to complete that and make sure the numbers add up. But the totals are accurate. It's just the subtotals that we're still working on. And I have another question of, is the county keeping track of how many participants are using the PACE program? Yeah, a really good question. That's one of our metrics to know whether the program is actually providing a benefit to our community. Is it being used? And if so, for what? So we are asking, requiring the PACE providers to give us quarterly metrics. And one of those metrics is actually how many, what types of projects, what level of projects, how many dollars, for those types of projects. So all of that will be in a report that we get quarterly and that we provide to the cities as well. Are there any other questions? I have something about Emily shared that if there are interested contractors on the webinar, she can connect you with one of the regional account managers to learn how that works and to get them authorized. So it's Emily Goodwin with Y Green. And I think, Emily, you could still speak if you wanted to share your contact information, or you could point them to a part of the website to get connected.
Sure. I will type in my contact information on the chat box if everyone can see that.
If you choose to all panelists and attendees, so you have to use the drop-down box, that's how they would see it. But for now, it's defaulting to just me. Okay, I think I've clicked the right one. Here we go. Okay. And I'll just say it right now. It's emily.goodwin@ygreen.com. And that's EMILY.GOODWIN@YGRENE.com. Thanks, Emily. So I have another question of, if someone needs a new roof when they get solar, would that be two different projects? And the answer that I'll give, and then I'll let Emily speak up. And if there are any other PACE providers, let me know, but I think that's the only one I recognize. My understanding is that it could be combined if it was really required for the solar system, but in most cases they would do them as two different financing terms because they may have different lives of the assessment. So it may be that you want a 20-year assessment for the solar and a 25-year assessment for the roof, and they would do them in one bucket, but it would be individualized so that the assessments end when the terms end. Emily, do you want to add anything or adjust?
I think that's pretty accurate. I think that would be a great question for one of our regional account managers, but I think you summarized it pretty well.
Okay, we got one of those questions in one of our in-person workshops, and that was, I think, my memory of how they answered it.
We could always do a sample project with various improvements included and show typically what the range of terms are for those. So it can't exceed the useful life of the improvement itself. That's one of the guardrails of the program, and consumer protection by design. But certainly you can negotiate, lower shorter terms if that works for you. But again, it really depends on the improvement itself.
Good. And as a clearer example, it may be that someone wants to do air conditioning and a roof, and the air conditioner is not going to last as long as the roof, so they cannot have the same number of years of term. So that would be important.
That's correct.
I have another question that asks, who provides the financing terms to the homeowner, the contractor or the third-party administrator? So again, I'll let Emily answer as well, but my understanding is that, it's the contractor that you have the primary conversations with in person, but some of the providers have told me that they follow up with a phone call afterward to be sure that the terms are understood. Emily, do you want to talk about your approach?
That's right. We set the terms. The contractor does not. The contractor just is the primary interface with the customer. But as soon as the application is submitted, it's sort of handed off, if you will, to our corporate team that handles the underwriting, customer service, establishes the terms of the finance agreement. So that's all done through the third-party administrator. Does that answer the question?
I think so. If someone wants to clarify, please feel free. Okay, I got a yes.
Okay.
Great. Let me scan up and be sure I'm not missing anything.
Oh, and I would just add one more thing. We do confirm terms call with all of our projects. So that's another consumer protection built into the program, which was the secondary piece of that question. I knew I was missing something, but we do the callbacks to make sure that the customers understand all of the terms of the program that they've agreed to before we sort of finalize the finance agreement. So we go through it when they apply for the program, when we initially populate the finance agreement, and then we do a callback to walk through those terms with the customer before we complete the execution of the contract.
Thank you. Good clarification. I have another question that if you want to receive a copy of the slides, you don't need to email us. We're going to email them to everyone who registered for the workshop. So we already have your email address and we'll send those after the presentation. Okay. We will also be sending you an evaluation if you wouldn't mind completing that for us. That'll help us improve these for others in the future, and it'll help us know what other questions you might have, because we will be adding things to our website in the frequently asked questions section, and we want to make sure that everyone's questions get answered for everyone's benefit. So, all right. I am not seeing any other questions, so I think we will end the webinar, but you'll get the slides by email, and then you can reply to that email if you have any further questions. Even if you get three months down the line and you're considering this program and you have questions, then we want to make sure that our community is very well informed on this and doesn't make any decisions that that they're uncertain about. So please let us know if you have questions, and if we can't answer them, we will connect you with the PACE providers as well. So thank you to everyone who joined today, and we will be in touch as we get more details and share the slides. Thanks so much for joining.